Hi class, I am coming to you straight from my back porch in historic Kenwood. I am outside because although it is hot and sticky out here, it is less loud than inside of my house. We have 4 adults and a baby in isolation with us. Well, I guess 5 total adults. No, 4 total adults and 1 baby. Whatever, in isolation with us. So it's a little bit of a zoo in there. Hopefully the baby will make a cameo. This is the first recorded lecture, so if I mess this up, I will hopefully be able to edit it, but if not, please bear with me because this is new for all of us. But I am excited to be talking to you today. I wish we were all in the classroom again, but this is going to have to do for now. I hope everyone's staying safe and keeping socially distant or harboring in place, depending on where you are. And I hope to hear from each of you soon and make sure you're okay. Today we are going to be lecturing on biodiversity and conservation. This week we're going to be looking at a topic. This is our topic, our first topic for the class, and we're also going to be looking at a case study of wolves. And remember, we talked about how we're having lenses in this class, which we've done several of. Case studies, we've only really had one, but we're starting to dive in with more topics, which is sort of a broader concept than case studies, as well as more case studies and a few more lenses. Please be sure that you also have open the quiz on Moodle. There are quizzes for some of our lectures, and this is one of them. The quiz just contains answers. The questions themselves will be interspersed among this slideshow. So you will get to one of these quiz questions. You should pause your video. I will remind you to do that. Go and then look at the quiz itself and select the correct answer. They should be very easy, but they're just participation points and easy for you to earn because in-class participation really isn't a thing anymore, although you will be participating in discussions and hopefully a video if you have access. So let's dive into biodiversity and conservation, this week's topic. Trying to advance the slide, and I can't. Okay, there we go. So today we are talking about life's diversity on Earth, and biodiversity is the variety of life all across the levels of biological organization. So biodiversity happens at the species level, at the level of genes, at the level of populations, level of communities, and of course at ecosystems. So we're looking at all different levels of life. And the 3 main types of diversity we're going to be talking about, and biodiversity we're going to be talking about today, are species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and genetic diversity. So let's start with species diversity. Species are distinct types of organisms or sets of individuals that all share the same characteristics, and also, for the most part anyway, can breed with one another and produce fertile offspring. There is some debate about whether species actually exist, but generally they're well accepted in the biological community. Species diversity, then, is the number and variety of species found in a particular area. And species diversity can actually be measured by 2 different measures. One is species richness, which is the number of species in a particular area, and the other is species evenness, or what we call relative abundance, which is how much the numbers of individuals of different species differ from one another. So what that means is if there are 4 different types of species in an area, and all 4 of those exist in the same amount, you have pretty even species, relative abundance of species. If you look at this image, community 1 and community 2, you can see that community 1 has the same number of species, 4 species, as community 2, but that they have different evenness. So the species richness is the same, but the evenness is different. In community 1, they're equally divided between the 4 different species. In community 2, 70% of the species are this one type of tree. So they have different relative abundance or evenness. Biodiversity can exist also at the subspecies level. So there are some populations of the same species that occur in different geographical areas and have slightly different characteristics than one another, but they're still considered the same species. But you can have diversity of subspecies as well. Genetic diversity is at a lower level than species diversity, and what it takes into account is that all individuals in a specific species are genetically distinct from one another to some degree, maybe a little bit, maybe a lot, and that variation is very important. So genetic diversity includes the differences in the DNA composition among individuals. The differences in genetic diversity are really important because they supply the material that's needed for adaptation to local conditions or to changing conditions. So if the environmental conditions of an area are changing, if there's more genetic diversity, it's more likely that at least some of the members of your population will have the traits necessary to survive. So populations with more diversity are more likely to continue to exist, they're more likely to be able to adapt, and this is particularly important for adapting to things like climate change. So a lack of genetic diversity makes species more susceptible to disease, and they can also lead to something called inbreeding depression. And inbreeding is when you have a very, very low level of species diversity. And when this happens when genetically similar individuals mate with one another and they can produce weak or defective offspring. So we've talked about species diversity, we've talked about genetic diversity, and now we're going to talk about ecosystem diversity. Ecosystem diversity is having a great number and a variety of different types of ecosystems in one geographic location. This can also mean diversity of communities and habitats within a specific ecosystem. So the geographical distribution of ecosystems or communities and how they're connected to one another, if they are patchy, if there is a continuous large area, these are all components of ecosystem diversity. So for example, if you have a coastline or a beach area that has craggy bluffs and sand dunes, but also beaches and offshore coral reefs and pelagic ocean ecosystems, this is an area, a geographic area with high ecosystem diversity versus just one big field or a monoculture of crops that's only one ecosystem and has low ecosystem diversity. So what I want you to do now is pause your video and answer question 1 of the Moodle quiz. The first question is, which form of biodiversity, that's supposed to be an of, not an if, which form of biodiversity deals with the evenness of species distributed across an ecosystem? Again, which form of biodiversity deals with the evenness of species distributed across an ecosystem? Go ahead and pause your video and answer that question. All right, now we're going to talk about the distribution of biodiversity. So we've talked about how species are distributed, but how is biodiversity itself distributed across the globe? And it turns out that this is very uneven. The highest levels of biodiversity are around the equator because there's more heat and solar energy and there's more humidity, and this leads to more plant growth. More plant growth means that these regions are more productive at the primary, the lowest level, and that means they can support more species and more individuals of different species from different layers above just the plants. There are also structurally diverse habitats. So these are ones that have more diversity in what kinds of structure is available, and they create more ecological niches. So, for example, forests usually support more diversity than grasslands. Not biodiversity, more diversity. Wow, I have a lot of typos in this. They support more diversity than grasslands because if you think about forests, there are lots of different types of vegetation. There are different levels at which different species can live. They can live in the canopy of the forest. They can live on the lower branches. They can live in the layer of underbrush, or they can live on the ground, versus a grassland, which is basically just one layer, the bottom. Ecosystem diversity tends to promote species diversity. So if there are lots of different types of ecosystems in one geographic area, there's also more likely to be more types of species. One really cool thing that we know is that we have no idea how many species exist on Earth. We've currently identified 1.8 million species, but there are likely to be between 3 and 300 million species on Earth. with the average being, or the average estimate being around 14 million species. Most of the ones that we haven't discovered are very, very small. They're hard for us to see or find. They will be insects or even pathogens and bacteria, or they are in very difficult to get to or access places, like, for instance, deep sea trenches. And there are species, unfortunately, that are going extinct before we've even discovered them. So distribution of biodiversity on Earth looks something like this. Like I said, the equator is sort of the hot spot for biodiversity, right? Quite literally. It's hotter and has more solar energy, so more photosynthesis, more plants. And because of that, you can see on our map here that areas around the equator also have higher levels of biodiversity, with red, orange, yellow being highest levels, then green being slightly lower, and then into the blues. This big area here, what's this? It's a desert. There's relatively little species diversity in the desert. Same with here. You can see up here, as we get into really, really cold areas, there's also less species diversity. Same with the deserts here in Australia. So this unevenness of species diversity can very clearly be seen from this map. Biodiversity. So biodiversity is really important for us. It has a lot of benefits. It has benefits for us and, of course, for the planet as a whole. And these are some of the many benefits of biodiversity. One of the first is that it enhances our food security. Human history has included us eating about 7,000 different species of animals and plants. But over time, that has narrowed down and narrowed down and narrowed down. And now about 90% of our food comes from only 15 crop species and 8 different livestock species. That's not very much. And one of the problems with that is that it leaves us vulnerable to crop failures. So if a disease comes in that wipes out, for instance, one species of potato, and it's the only type of potato that we eat, which you'll see more when we talk about food and agriculture and French fries, then we will be vulnerable to the failure of that crop and to us having to figure out a whole new source of food. This is actually what happened in the Great Potato Famine of Ireland, which again, we'll talk more about in the coming weeks. So food security. Another thing that is given to us by biodiversity is the ability to get drugs and medicines from different organisms. About half of the pharmaceuticals we have today actually are derived from chemical compounds that are found in wild plants. And the sales of these different pharmaceuticals adds up to about $150 billion. Many medical applications for plants and the chemicals found in plants haven't even been discovered yet. And it's possible that they would hold the cure to many diseases that we are currently facing. No one has told me that they're thinking about curing coronavirus with a plant found in the Amazon rainforest, but who knows? So the possibility of future drugs and medicines also hangs in the balance of biodiversity. We've talked a lot about ecosystem services this semester already, but we're still going to be talking about it. We know that there are innumerable benefits that we receive from natural systems, and these are enhanced by biodiversity. Your textbook has a list on page 172 that includes food, fuel, fiber, and shelter, purification of air and water, detoxification and decomposition of waste, stability of Earth's climate, moderation of floods, droughts, temperatures, cycling of nutrients and renewing soil fertility, pollination of plants, including many of our crops, controlling pests and diseases, maintaining genetic resources for crop varieties, livestock, and medicines, and providing cultural and aesthetic benefits. So ecosystems provide us with many free services that we don't pay for in our economy, and we've talked about how to value that and how much it would actually be. About $148 trillion per year is given to us for free from ecosystem services that biodiversity contributes to directly. In relation to that, biodiversity helps maintain the functioning of healthy ecosystems. And when we lose critical species from an ecosystem, sometimes that can cause the collapse of the entire ecosystem itself. And this is something we'll be looking more into later this week when we talk about wolves and the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. So biodiversity helps those ecosystems maintain their resiliency. It helps them stay moving and going the way that they're supposed to, but also it helps them become more resilient under stress. If there are many, many different animals or bugs, for instance, that fill one niche, if one goes extinct, then there are others that may be able to step up to the plate. But if we only have one species that's capable of doing one function, then the whole ecosystem collapses with the loss of that species. And then finally, another anthropocentric view of biodiversity is that biodiversity boosts our economies through tourism and recreation. And there are countries in the world whose economies rely very, very heavily on tourism and ecotourism for their main source of income, such as Costa Rica. So loss of biodiversity will have economic impacts on the ecotourism industry in that country as well. So biodiversity gives us and the world many, many benefits. All right, it's time for quiz question number 2. So please pause your video and answer question number 2 on the Moodle quiz. The question is, 90% of the food humans consume today comes from 8 species of livestock and how many species of crops? Again, 90% of the food humans consume today come from 8 species of livestock and how many species of crops? Go ahead and pause your video. Okay, let's talk about biodiversity loss, because this is sort of the hot button issue with this particular topic. And of course, extinction. And we are coming back around to the idea of the 6th extinction, and Colbert calling us one weedy species. In the wake of our human activities, are species that are winning, quote unquote, and species that are losing. And the winners tend to be generalists, or species that can do a great deal of different things or survive in a great deal of different environments. So for instance, things we usually think of as pests, cockroaches, mice, raccoons, those generally tend to be winners because they're generalists. The losers in the wake of our actions tend to be specialists, or species that require very specialized conditions in order to survive. Often large mammals who have very long lifespans and slow reproductive rates are not well suited to adapt to changes in ecosystems that we cause. So we are back to talking about the 6th mass extinction, and I want you to remember that we said that mass extinctions events occur when extinction rates are significantly higher than background extinction rates, and that we've had 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history, and we are currently causing the 6th mass extinction. And remember that the 5 mass extinctions we've had before have all been natural, quote-unquote, geologic causes or something of the like, such as ice ages, deoxygenated water, volcanic eruptions, and asteroids. And the 6th mass extinction is happening because of this one weedy species, aka you and me. And the extinction rate now is between 100 and 1,000 times greater than the background extinction rate, which is how we know we are in the midst of a mass extinction. So what are the things that we're doing as a species that are causing this extinction? Well, there are 5 overarching things that we do that contribute. And the first is the creation of, or the destruction of habitat, creating habitat loss. Habitat loss is in fact the largest contributing factor to biodiversity loss. And this is the one that we've been doing the most and we've been doing the longest, the single greatest threat to biodiversity, at least right now. Species habitats are very specific to what works for them. They live in environments that are specialized, and they are specialized for those environments. And so when a habitat is lost, many, especially of the specialist species, are not able to move and adapt to new places. Habitat can be lost when we destroy it outright or when we fragment it. And habitat fragmentation is essentially when some sort of human activity like farming or logging cuts a larger habitat into smaller pieces, and the species aren't able to move back and forth between them. This can mean that species that have a really large range are have their range truncated and aren't able to hunt in the way that they used to, for instance. Or it can mean that the genetic diversity of a species becomes much smaller because they are forced to breed with or reproduce with a smaller number of individuals in their fragmented area. Roads can do this, expanding grasslands for herding and grazing of livestock, bringing in agricultural fields. And again, these can block animals from moving to place, and also can block plants from being able to reproduce with others of their species. Pollution is another one of our great impacts on species diversity and biodiversity. Air pollution, water pollution, noise and light pollution. Speaking of noise pollution, you may be able to hear an airplane right now. They can all have significant impacts on biodiversity, on plants and animals. Also, we have a tendency to release heavy metals that weren't in particular ecosystems into those ecosystems through the water. Endocrine disrupting compounds are medicine. We often, either if pills are directly flushed or when we excrete them in our pee, they end up in the water system as well. And that medicine can actually have bad impacts for animals and plants down the line from us. Oil spills and other large pollution events are, of course, problems. And now one of the main things we talk about when it comes to pollution is plastic in our waterways, which can cause choking hazards, be eaten, and otherwise poison the animals in those waterways as well. Overharvesting is something that we're pretty good at because it turns out that regulating our use of resources isn't one of our best skills. And some of the biggest issues we have with overharvesting have to do with poaching. Poaching is contributing to our illegal global trade of wildlife, and those products, that industry surpasses $20 billion per year. And this is a big problem, for instance, in the African savanna, like in the Serengeti, if this wasn't parkland that was really well maintained. But there's also poaching of gorillas and primates for bushmeat in Africa and in Central Africa in particular. And there are often illegal wildlife poaching is happening for traditional medicines and the delicacies of certain types of cuisines. We also have a problem with overharvesting of the oceans, particularly of large species of fish and marine life, but also even some of the smaller species. And when we get into fresh waters and oceans, we'll look more at what that is. But for an example, we have decimated at least one whale population and have been working towards doing so with several other whale populations. And we also have an issue with other large species like sharks. Shark fin trade is a massive problem for the shark species as well, and is also just a brutal practice. It's estimated that we currently have about 10% of the large ocean-dwelling animals that we used to have. So we've had a big loss in ocean animals because of our overharvesting practices. Invasive species are fascinating, and they connect back to other things we've talked about this semester. So if you will remember in the sixth extinction, the reason why the chytrid fungus has been moving amongst the amphibians is because of the movement of two specific types of amphibians, two specific type of frogs, from one place where they originally lived to other places where they did not live. So one you'll remember is the frog-leg soup, which was moving American bullfrogs that could carry the chytrid fungus, but were not susceptible to it. And the other one is the out of Africa hypothesis, which talks about that frog that was used as a pregnancy test, that also could carry the chytrid fungus but wasn't affected by it, out of Africa. And there are lots of different invasive species that are part of our lives now. Some of them have actually been beneficial and have increased biodiversity in areas, but many of them when they actually take hold, are no longer subject to the same sort of predation, for instance, that they had in their original habitat, and can go nuts. An example of that is this lovely friend here. This is the lionfish. Lionfish are native to the Pacific, but they were accidentally introduced in the Atlantic and actually in the Caribbean, and actually their introduction was traced back to two individuals who were likely dumped out of an aquarium, like a fish tank, a person's fish tank, not a major aquarium, and have become a massive problem all over the Caribbean. They have no natural predators here. The eels, for instance, have not learned to eat them. They are poisonous, their spines are poisonous, and they are voracious eaters, and they're just completely decimating the populations of all different types of fish all over the reef and causing ecosystem collapse. And one of the issues with them is that they can, or two main issues, they can exist at almost any depth. So you'll see them at 5 feet and you'll see them at 300 feet. And in the Pacific, their breeding cycle was very short because of the time that it was warm enough. But in the Caribbean, it's warm enough year round, so they're breeding year round. So their populations are just exploding. So invasive species, often accidentally introduced, can have massive impacts. Islands are particularly susceptible because there's nowhere for the species that normally live on those islands to go. So islands like those in Hawaii have been really heavily impacted by humans bringing in rats and cats. So invasive species there as well. And then finally, climate change. Climate change is one of the major causes of biodiversity loss. Although it's actually caused some biodiversity loss now, it's projected in the future to cause significantly more than it already has. A warming world means that different species will have trouble adapting to changes in temperature, changes in precipitation. Species that are particularly immobile, like trees, for instance, aren't really able to move quickly enough to get out of the way or to get into places that are more suited for them. And coral reefs are also in danger because of climate change, as well as, you know, the polar bear, which we hear about all the time. It's not that I don't care about polar bears, it's just that there are lots of other problems as well. So these are some of the major causes of biodiversity loss. So it is time for quiz question number 3. So make sure you have your Moodle quiz open to number 3. And the question is, which consequence of human activity is the single greatest threat to biodiversity today? Which consequence of human activity is the single greatest threat to biodiversity today? Please pause your video and answer question number 3. Okay, let's talk about conservation and the practice of conservation. One of the key components of conservation itself is a discipline called conservation biology. And conservation biology is devoted to understanding the different factors and forces and processes that both influence the loss of biodiversity, but also help us to protect biodiversity. So conservation biology is helping to develop solutions to problems like habitat degradation and species loss. Conservation efforts around the globe, as part of conservation biology and also as part of advocacy, often focus on endangered species. And so we have a great deal of legislation, both in the US and internationally. I guess a great deal is sort of an exaggeration. We have several pieces of legislation to deal with endangered species. In the United States, we in 1973 passed the Endangered Species Act, and this protects different species that are judged as endangered or threatened, and it forbids their trade and also the destruction of them and the habitats that support them. It does include, however, provisions for landowners to try to sort of balance the interests of humans and those endangered species. And to date, it hasn't really stopped a lot of development projects, although it has made people do things like submit environmental impact statements, for instance. Internationally, one of the treaties that has been formed by the UN to help deal with endangered species issues is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, also called CITES. And this is the one that actually bans the international transport of endangered species and their body parts. So, for instance, the banning of the ivory trade, which happened in the 70s, or I'm sorry, in the 90s, although internationally it happened in the 90s. It's only really been adapted in individual countries like the United States in 2016 and in China in 2017. But international trade of ivory has been banned since the 90s. So some of these conservation efforts have been successful, others have been not so much, but the fact that those legislations exist is really is a really good thing. But again, they're very focused on endangered species specifically. So one might say they're very biocentric. Another way that we attempt to bring back endangered species or even extinct species is through captive breeding and reintroduction. Some species are extinct in particular locations, but aren't extinct globally, or maybe are still, they still exist in captivity. For instance, like the frogs we talked about in the first section on the sixth extinction. Those frogs and amphibians can't really be reintroduced anytime soon because the chytrid fungus is still out there. But there are instances in which we can actually bring back the species by breeding them in captivity and then reintroducing them. And on Wednesday, you will be watching, or actually whenever you want, you can watch it now. You'll be watching the video and reading about wolves in Yellowstone as a case study on reintroduction of species to a particular habitat. Another thing the textbook talks about is cloning of species. We do have some pretty crazy technology for cloning, and there has been talk about bringing back species from extinction through cloning. We haven't done so successfully, but it is theoretically possible, although there are a lot of sticky moral and ethical questions associated with that. Like, for instance, if we bring back a species to a habitat that doesn't exist anymore, is that the right thing to do? Is that morally okay? What's the point of doing it even? And some of that ties back, of course, to the Osterwalderplassen, which you guys might have remembered talking about at the beginning of the semester, and the concept of rewilding. Lots of course connections here. When we are looking at conserving and preserving species diversity and biological diversity, and particularly endangered species, we're often looking at biodiversity hotspots like these ones in red that are shown here. And biodiversity hotspots are places in which there are a large number of endemic species, so species that only exist in that area. And our biodiversity hotspots used to cover about almost 16% of the planet, and now they cover only about 2.3% of the planet because mostly of habitat loss. So there's a lot of focus on these places as ones we need to preserve and, for instance, bring in parks and create protected areas in order to try to keep the biodiversity of those areas from being lost any further than they already are. You'll notice in this map that we're looking at hotspots on land, but also biological diversity hotspots in different areas of the ocean as well, particularly around coral reefs. So this brings us into some connections to ethics, right? Connections to ethics about conservationism, preservationism, and the idea of intrinsic value. So questions that we begin to ask here is, how do these ideas of conservation as an ethic, not as a practice necessarily, come into play when we think about conservation as a practice like conservation biology? And in some ways, it's not exactly the same as Pinchot's idea of conservationism, right? The most good for the most people, because although we are trying to conserve these biodiversity resources for the future because they are going to be good for many people, there are often ecocentric motives or biocentric motives in conservation efforts, not just anthropocentric motives. So I think we can say that it goes a little bit further than Pinchot's version of conservation. But it is still, at its heart, very anthropocentric because we're still talking about trying to preserve areas for tourism or ecotourism or food security, etc. Still, we're moving past Pinchot. What about preservationism? We're talking about creation of parks and protected areas, especially around those hot spots. And these can be perhaps a good example of preservationist values coming into play. And an example of that would be the discussion of the Serengeti National Park at the beginning of this chapter. So preservationism, again, can be displayed here when we look at how it is we can set aside this area from human use, particularly from human exploitation, although one might argue that ecotourism, or maybe less ecologically minded tourism, is still a form of exploitation in some way. And then the question is also, are we doing these things to protect the intrinsic value of the species and ecosystems? So aside from what it is that these ecosystems and this biodiversity can provide for us, aside from how it might benefit us economically or medically, do these have a right to exist? Do ecosystems have a right to exist on their own without our intervention? And I think there are many among us who would say yes. But the question, of course, becomes, how do we decide what is right in these systems? Because we also often are thinking about the interests of humanity, not just for selfish economic reasons, but also interests of public health or of justice and inequality. These questions all start to swirl around one another and become connected to one another. So one way to think about these a little more is thinking about that park in the Serengeti National Park, which is in Tanzania, and then also is connected to a park in Kenya, which is, I think, the Kenyan Masai Mara National Reserve. So when we apply ethical lenses to look at this park, we have this massive area that's been set aside. The Maasai continue to use it for herding, but otherwise it's just used for tourism. And there's been proposals to put this huge highway through the middle of it, right? And the issue, of course, here would be habitat fragmentation. One of the most spectacular and strange things that happens on Earth is this great wildebeest migration. It's the largest land migration in the world. I've actually seen it, which is incredible. It's insane, the number of beasts that are moving quickly across this large swath of land, and the highway would actually cut this off. And there would be, aside from the movement of this one species, there would be disastrous biodiversity and ecosystem consequences for multiple different ecosystems and species here. But there are people on one side of the park who are essentially cut off from the rest of the continent of Africa by the park. And they're living in abject poverty on this side. And having this highway would benefit them significantly because they would suddenly be able to trade their goods with the rest of the country and with the rest of the continent. They would be connected in a way that they haven't been connected before, and it would help bring them out of poverty. So how do we decide what's right in this situation? It's a really tough one. Now, the chapter talks about some other possible ideas, how to go around the park, etc. But this concept comes up again and again, and the example of Serengeti is just a very large and dramatic version of it. The other thing about the Serengeti and parks like it is that they help us look ahead to the lens that we're going to be examining next week, which is the idea of social construction of nature and social construction of wilderness. And it talks about the preservationist ideal of wilderness as a place that is untouched by humans, that ideal doesn't exist, and it's constructed in our minds as a social construction, and we'll define that better. But the need to protect those areas from human intervention in some cases has led us to actually kicking native peoples off of their land in order to create a park, like in Yosemite and in Yellowstone, and also in places in Central Africa as well as East Africa. And this has created an actual class of people called conservation refugees, people who have been kicked off their land for conservation purposes. So we have to talk about the justice problems that arise from conservation as well, and we're going to get into that next week. So that's sort of a preview of what's coming. One possible solution, though, which might remind you a bit of commons management, is the idea of community-based conservation. So the promise here is that if we can help people and wildlife and ecosystems at the same time, we might be able to do that by engaging local people in the effort to protect the wildlife and the land. If they become invested in the efforts and they start acting as stewards, they can see the benefits to themselves, and it's also much more, often more successful for creating that protection because they are more invested in the idea, and they are more populated in the area, and they're better able to help enforce things like keeping poachers off of land. It's really important when we do community-based conservation efforts that the economic benefits of the preservation, like for instance income from ecotourism, is shared with local people as part of those efforts. And this can actually help make up for some of the loss or restrictions in land use. So for instance, if we have an area, a protected area that we are telling local peoples they cannot use for grazing, for instance, they need to be compensated with, for instance, the sum of the money that is accrued from ecotourism to that area. This kind of solution may help benefit the people who are stuck on the coastal side of the Serengeti, who are unable to get access to the rest of the country. These efforts have been successful in some places and not been successful in others, but they do hold promise as a potential way to help make sure that we are not committing acts of environmental injustice while attempting to help the environment. So it's time for quiz question 4. So the question is, involving local people and communities in helping to manage and protect biodiversity is called what? Again, involving local people and communities in helping to manage and protect biodiversity is called what? You can pause your video here and answer question 4 on the Moodle quiz. All right, y'all, we have reached the end of the biodiversity and conservation slideshow presentation lecture. And so I want to talk to you about what's happening for the rest of the week. We're trying out all these new formats online. So if any of this isn't working for you, you need to talk to me. And you need to make an appointment for office hours, which you can now do in the You Can Book Me scheduler, which is the link for which is on your new syllabus that I have hopefully emailed to you and is also at the top of the Moodle. You can book a time for me on Monday mornings or on Thursday afternoons, but I will also be holding open hours from 9 to 11, I believe, on Wednesdays. And that means essentially I will just be sitting in a Google Meet. I'll send you the link every Wednesday, and you can just drop in and ask me a question. Just be aware that other students may be there as well. So if it's a super private question, you may want to either email me or set up an appointment time. But I'll be there ready to answer anything. The rest of the things that you need to do this week, you need to read the chapter 11 from Robbins et al., which is on wolves. It's our next case study, as well as an article called Should It Be Saved on Moodle by Cornwall, not Cronwell. And the next lecture, Wolves in Conservation, will also be posted underneath of Wednesday. On Wednesday at 12:20, we're going to start a small group video discussion. I will be assigning groups randomly on Moodle and invite you to a Google Meet with your small group. And I will also be posting questions for you to discuss in your group. I will be jumping in and out of all of the different Google Meets in order to listen in on your discussions, perhaps add some things, answer questions, and then I'll move on to the next Google Meet. If you have time, you might want to practice Google Meeting with someone you know, another student, for instance. Just make sure you know how to use the program. It's simple and it's free now for all Eckerd people. And again, make appointments for office hours if you need to. On Moodle, there is a box at the end of each week that says things that are due by 11:59 on Friday. And that includes the quiz from today's lecture. It includes participating in the video discussion if you are able to. It includes this week's assignment. And I'm actually going to pull up Moodle so I can check and make sure that I haven't missed anything. So we'll just pull it up right now and look at Moodle. All right, here's Moodle. You see in my editing mode right now. Quiz responses, assignment 7, and environmental news presentations for Sabine, Janessa, and Alex. I'll send out more information on what's necessary for those. So make sure that you get those things in and done. by the end of the week. I realize that not everybody can do everything at the same time online because not everyone has equal email or internet access. Oh, you probably couldn't see that. Hold on. There we go. Here are the things that are due by Friday. All right. It has been awesome talking to you all. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will be seeing you on the next lecture. Make an appointment to talk to me. How do I stop this? I can't stop it. Okay, there it is. Bye.